John, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started, and
Sure.
we'll get into the questions.
Sure. Well, first of all, Katie, thank you for having me, and I am delighted to be a part of Pink Petro. Probably the most important things to say are that my wife, Katie's friend, now runs a children's hospital, so she's an executive. Katie, of course, is an executive. I have one daughter who's an executive at Dell. I have a daughter who's a clinical psychologist, and I have another daughter who's heading off to University of Virginia Law School. So lots of professional women in the Reed family, and they put me in my place regularly. And I just briefly, as a coach, I started out in life. I went to college, and then I went to business school, and I worked for 12 years in management consulting, and then decided to go back to school for 5 years to get trained as an organizational psychologist and executive coach. Finished that 20 years ago and have been doing organizational development, change management, and executive coaching ever since. And I'm very lucky. I love what I do. I discovered when I became an executive coach that if you could fog a mirror and chew gum at the same time, you could call yourself an executive coach. There were no professional educational requirements, no licensure requirements, no nothing. And unfortunately, that is still true today. So it was my wife who Katie knows this, who said to me, why don't you try to do something that would be helpful to people who are considering executive coaching, like helping them evaluate the person in front of them who is describing themselves as an executive coach. So a few years ago wrote this book called Pinpointing Excellence, and apparently it's been helpful to people in sort of navigating through this unregulated marketplace where literally anybody can claim to be an executive coach. And basically it says if you are talking with someone who is an executive coach, you should be clarifying with them that they have at least 4 things. One is depth in business, training, and experience, because
so you're going to have something that's deep, right?
Something that's deep.
Depth.
Substantive. Like you, Katie, you have got years in senior positions at BP and Shell, for example.
I don't know that that's depth. There's just a lot of stress.
But
I get what you're saying.
A lot of stress.
I get what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, if there were no stress, I would still have hair.
Exactly. So depth.
Depth in business, training, maybe MBA, something like that, plus practical experience. I would say the vast majority of people who claim to be executive coaches don't have that. Secondly, psychological training, because executive coaching involves a lot of behavior change and working through resistance and understanding what might be triggering or blocking someone in trying to get better.
Okay.
So having training in psychology or some other social science, psychiatry, maybe social work, is very important, because you have to understand the person across from you. And I would say that there are tens of thousands of people in executive coaching who have no training like that at all.
Yep.
Third, coaching training. As you guys probably know, there are now well over 1,000 different coach training programs globally. Some of them are fairly solid. In other words, they give you good grounding in some basic coaching approaches, but they don't provide business training and they don't provide psychological training, so they're not a substitute.
It's like a real business,
it's a gigantic
coaching business of coaching coaches.
Of training coaches.
Okay.
Right?
Thousands of dollars.
Huge amounts of money. And,
Okay.
and there's, again, like there's no requirement to be an executive coach. There are no requirements to start an executive coach training business.
Okay.
So the vast majority of coach training programs are, to put it kindly, lightweight or bogus. But if consumers don't know that, and they just hear somebody say, well, you know what, I'm trained as an executive coach, they have no idea. Trained where? Trained at what level? And then lastly, we could talk about this for the whole hour.
Yeah, I know.
Lastly, ethics. So I work under 3 ethics codes: the American Psychological Association, the International Coach Federation, and the Association of Corporate Executive Coaches. I personally think that when people make investments of a lot of money in executive coaching, they need to know that the person they're working with adheres to a very strong ethics code.
Okay.
So if you just apply those 4 criteria just as a starting point to people who talk about being an executive coach, you'll discover 2 things. Not many people meet those criteria, even though they're important. But if you ask people to start meeting those criteria, that's the way consumers can start to improve the marketplace, right? And if you don't hear that people have those criteria, then I would suggest you move on and choose somebody else.
The next question is, have you observed a mentoring / coaching difference when men coach women or women coach men? Is it better to have the same gender mentor / coach? Now, first of all, I think you should break down the difference between a mentor and a coach,
Yes.
because there is a difference.
Yes.
And I can speak to that as well. But then we can get into the gender piece. Do you see differences between men coaching women, women coaching men, and is it better to have the same gender? So
Okay.
start away. It's like a 3-part question.
It's a 3. Okay, so just, I think you guys all know this, but just to state some of the basics, a mentor is someone that you go to because you want to adopt or emulate or model yourself after that person in what they do, how they've made choices, how they manage themselves, right? So it's very straightforward. And if you are, for example, a woman, let's just say you're a senior executive in the energy sector, and you are an example of someone who has done a great job of advancing her career, moving up through the glass ceiling, if you will, and you have people who want you to mentor them, well, they're going to be coming to you for advice so that they can adopt your best practices, right? Basically, that's a mentoring relationship. Coaching is about applying the skills in the area we just described in business, in psychology, in coaching, and doing it ethically. And at least in my experience over 20 plus years, the more experience a person has, regardless of their gender, the more valuable they are as, say, a coach, but also the more discriminating they are as someone who's selecting a coach. So I can think of, let me see if I can describe that, a couple of women who are very senior in large energy companies who I've had a chance to work with. I don't think they selected me because I was a man or because I was a woman per se. I think they selected me because of skill and experience. I don't mean to sound pompous about it, but and I think that's because they themselves had 20 to 25 years of experience in working with both men and women. What they wanted was a thought partner, a problem solver, someone who could bring some sort of perspective from those different skill sets that I was talking about, and the gender of that person didn't particularly matter.
Clearly, there was a match,
The chemistry.
a chemistry, because there's
Yeah.
got to be.
Yep.
And I thought, you know what, he might be able to help me at this time in my career, whereas, early in my career, I went a different direction. But I'm kind of with you on the gender thing. I don't think it's the first thing, and I don't think that there's a difference. It gets down to having that initial conversation with who you're going to be your coach, and then get that person to understand, do they click with you? Does it work? Because otherwise, it's kind of like, and I don't mean to like minimize this and make you a hairdresser, but my hairdresser is like my second is like my psychologist, right? Because you're trusting somebody to make you feel good, right, and look good, and right, and so it's just like a doctor, somebody that you need to be able to trust and build rapport with, someone you feel like you've got chemistry with. So I'm glad you brought that up. But there was a moment in my decision making process, like, hey, it might be good to have a guy's perspective, right?
Well, and so you raise a great point, Katie. So whether it's going to a hairdresser or a doctor, let's just say you're deciding on a gynecologist, right?
Okay.
What do you know? You know that anybody who is out there identifying themselves as a gynecologist, they've done several things. They have graduated from high school. They have graduated from college. They have graduated from medical school. They have finished an OBGYN residency and internship. They are now licensed, right? And they have continuing education requirements just to maintain that license, just to be in the marketplace providing services.
Right.
Right. You know all that to begin with, and then you want to look at things like chemistry and rapport and all
bedside
that.
manner, all of that. No,
those are all important.
But I'm glad you bring this up.
But here's the thing. If you're looking for an executive coach, the reason why, for example, that book helps you focus in on those 4 things is because anybody can claim to be an executive coach, and anybody who does that might have a very nice bedside manner,
right,
which is an important thing. They might be a nice person. They might be someone that you enjoy talking with, and they might also know nothing about those 4 areas that we just talked about. That's the difference. So my own opinion is that you gotta verify capabilities and then look at chemistry. Chemistry is not a substitute for capabilities, but chemistry is important once you know the capabilities are there.
Do you have any thoughts about the value of face-to-face versus virtual coaching?
Yeah, I 20 some odd years ago when I started doing this, the norm was to jump on a plane and fly to whatever the city was where the client was.
That's very expensive.
It was yes, it was.
Is this why coaching
expensive.
is so bling?
It was fairly expensive,
Okay.
But at the senior level they have pretty good budgets. But and I still think face-to-face coaching, particularly early in the relationship, is important in building trust and a sense of safety with the client. But increasingly, people in the C-suite, for example, are traveling all over the place. I travel all over the place, principally in North America, to some degree overseas. And it's becoming more the norm now for people simply to say, look, let's use Zoom or let's use Skype. I had a client recently in the Ukraine, right, who who came back and forth to Houston periodically, so we would get together personally, and that was important. But most of the coaching took place at 4 o'clock in the morning for me, and I couldn't even tell you, maybe 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm not even sure what the time difference was. And that worked fine because the quality of video and sound, you can see facial expressions, you can hear fluctuations in people's voices, you can see eye movement, you can see a lot of nonverbal communication, which tells you a lot about what's going on in the conversation. So I'm getting to a point where I think Zoom, for example, is not quite as good as in person, but it's pretty good.